Vladimir Putin must have thought he had seen it all from Ukraine. He must have believed that after surviving the initial shock of Western precision missiles, Western tanks, and Western drones, his army had finally stabilized the front lines. He was wrong. It is only getting worse for Russia's soldiers on the battlefield, and the nightmare they are now facing is not a brand new, highly classified hypersonic missile. Instead, it is a ghost from the Cold War, a massive roaring beast of American steel that the United States built decades ago. The US created one of the most unapologetically powerful weapons in the world, and Ukraine is now using it to absolutely crush Russian soldiers into the mud. Without any real fanfare, without a massive press conference from the Pentagon, Ukraine has just casually added one of the world's most fearsome artillery guns to its arsenal, and it has made Russia's defensive structures and meat assault tactics entirely useless. Ukraine itself never expected this to happen, and Russia had absolutely no idea it was coming. But thanks to American engineering from a bygone era, Ukraine now possesses a devastating weapon that it can use to violently shatter Russia's grinding war of attrition. The weapon in question is the massive 203mm M110 self-propelled howitzer, an absolute titan of the battlefield that has officially been given to the 52nd Artillery Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. According to United 24 Media, the brigade itself has confirmed the arrival of this mechanical monster, noting that it is slotting in perfectly alongside domestically made Ukrainian artillery to completely shatter Russia's ongoing offensives. In a casual social media post, the 52nd Brigade announced that their equipment now includes the Bodna self-propelled howitzer, the Vampire multiple launch rocket systems, and the 203mm M110A. They mentioned it almost like an afterthought, a minor detail tacked onto the end of a sentence. But it is not an afterthought. It is a terrifying escalation in firepower, and you are going to find out exactly why the arrival of this specific artillery gun in Ukraine is going to force a massive bloody shift on the battlefield very soon. To understand the sheer panic this is causing in Russian command centers, we first have to ask the question, how did Ukraine manage to get its hands on M110 howitzers in the first place? This is a weapon that was born in the fires of the Cold War. It is a piece of machinery that the United States military has officially retired from active service. Because of that, you would naturally assume that there would be absolutely no chance that Ukraine could ever get it deployed to the Eastern Front. However, in the brutal mathematics of war, a retired weapon does not necessarily equate to an obsolete one. A 200-pound shell packed with high explosives does not care what year it is when it detonates inside a Russian trench line. The origins of the MO-110s that are currently tearing up the soil in Ukraine can be traced back to a masterstroke of a deal made late in the year. Army Recognition reported that Greece had quietly approved the transfer of 60 of its United States-made artillery systems directly to Ukraine. And it was not just the guns. The deal included 150,000 of the massive 203mm shells the system needs to feed its hunger, alongside a batch of Zuni rockets. This entire package was valued at roughly 199 million euros, or a little under $230 million. The artillery and the ammunition were set to make their long journey to the Ukrainian front lines via the Czech Republic, and the systems were sent exactly as they were, without any lengthy delays for Western modifications or refurbishment. They were raw, ready, and lethal. At first glance, some might look at those numbers and think that Greece was getting the better end of the deal by offloading old equipment for a pile of cash, but that could not be further from the truth. For Ukraine, this deal was an absolute steal. It meant that they were instantly getting their hands on a large number of heavy artillery systems that have long been a literal specter of death on the battlefield for any hostile force that has ever come up against them. Make no mistake, the M110 howitzer is not a modern computer with tracks. It is not ultra clever. It does not rely on fragile touchscreens or satellite uplinks to do its job. What it does, and what it does better than almost anything else on Earth, is deliver catastrophic, earth-shattering amounts of firepower very quickly. We have to remember that the war in Ukraine has evolved into something deeply terrifying. In many ways, it feels like a dark time capsule. It is a horrific echo of how the grinding, brutal trench battles of the First and Second World Wars were fought, rather than the clean, conventional, high-tech conflicts defense contractors expected to see in the 21st century. And in a war of mud, blood, and concrete bunkers, you do not always need a scalpel. Sometimes you desperately need a sledgehammer. The M110 is that sledgehammer. And the terror for the Russian army does not stop there, because more of these beasts may be on their way. Military analysts note that the Greek armed forces have operated the MO-110A2 variant since the early 1980s, and that Greece held approximately 145 units of this heavy artillery system in its inventory before they announced the transfer of the initial 60 units to Ukraine. For decades, this American-made system was Greece's ultimate long-range artillery solution. It was the gun they kept pointed at their rivals, waiting for the day things went hot. Recently, however, the system became surplus to their requirements as Greece began modernizing its military to standard 155mm NATO systems. But one nation's surplus is another nation's salvation. For Ukraine, that Greek modernization represented a golden opportunity. It was a chance to lay claim to the kind of heavy bunker-busting artillery that can literally turn Russian defensive fortifications into craters and cripple entire battalions of troops as they attempt to launch mechanized assaults across open fields. It was a brilliant deal all around, but it looks even better for Ukraine when you crack open the cargo crates and look at the exact breakdown of the ammunition that was packaged alongside those 60 howitzers. Reports indicate that Ukraine has received 50,000 high-explosive M106 rounds as part of this transfer. To put that into perspective, each one of those rounds weighs about 200 pounds and is designed to create a blast radius that liquefies anything caught too close. But that is just the standard ammunition. The deal also included 40,000 rocket-assisted M650 rounds. These are shells equipped with an internal rocket motor that ignites mid-flight, propelling the massive projectile across the sky to strike targets up to 18.5 miles away. On top of that, Ukraine received 30,000 M509A1 dual-purpose cluster munitions, and another 30,000 M404 improved conventional munitions. These specialized shells were engineered later in the howitzer's service life, designed specifically to break apart in the sky and rain down highly lethal submunitions over a massive area, shredding infantry and light armor over an area the size of several football fields. This variety of ammunition means that the howitzers Ukraine has just deployed will not just be unimaginably powerful, they will be incredibly versatile. They can smash a concrete bunker with a high explosive shell and 2 minutes later load a cluster munition to wipe out a platoon of Russian infantry attempting to flank their position. This flexibility is going to make them one of the most heavily hunted targets by Russian drone operators, but also one of the most valuable assets Ukraine currently has on the board. But before we dive into exactly how these weapons are rewriting the rules of the current front line, we have to answer another massive question. Could Ukraine get its hands on even more M110 howitzers now that they have integrated this initial batch? The answer appears to be a resounding yes. If the reports about Greece's strategic stockpiles are completely accurate, there should be another 85 M110s sitting in reserves that could potentially be transferred. Of course, this assumes that the remaining hardware has been maintained well enough to be immediately useful in high-intensity combat. The world will have to wait and see if any follow-up deals can be struck. Greece has the opportunity to profit heavily from a system it no longer needs, while Ukraine gets a weapon tailor-made to cause unimaginable carnage to a Russian military that is largely fighting this war as though they are stuck in the tactics of the 1950s. However, the most tantalizing question lies across the Atlantic. Will Ukraine be able to tap directly into the United States to pull more M110s from American ghost fleets and desert boneyards? After all, this is fundamentally an American weapon, forged by American defense contractors. Right now, there is a powerful initiative in place that allows NATO nations to purchase weapons directly from the United States, which are then packaged and delivered to the Ukrainian front. It is called the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, or PURL. This initiative could be the ultimate key to Ukraine unlocking a massive supply line of these heavy howitzers, assuming their performance in the Donbass proves so undeniably devastating that Ukrainian generals demand more of them. Ukraine's NATO allies have been using this system brilliantly. Billions of dollars in military aid have been funneled through PURL. It is a highly efficient concept because it allows Ukraine to specifically dictate exactly what it needs to survive and win, rather than just politely accepting whatever random mismatched equipment its allies decide to donate out of the goodness of their hearts. Ukraine points at a weapon system, the allies write the check, and the United States ships the hardware directly to the fight. So theoretically, this could be the route taken to access the legendary United States stockpiles of M110s. But there is a historical mystery here. According to military historians, the United States produced over 1,100 M110 howitzers after first introducing the weapon into service back in 1963. We know the system is still somewhat active in various countries around the world. Nations like Turkey, Spain, Bahrain, Morocco, and Jordan have operated them. Spain in particular could feasibly be persuaded to send a batch to Ukraine. But when it comes to the United States inventory, the water gets murky. Official records make the somewhat contradictory claim that the M110 is both technically active in certain obscure capacities, but was largely retired in the 1990s, leaving the lighter 155mm M109 Paladin as America's primary self-propelled howitzer. So what actually happened to those 1,100 American Titans? We know the fate of at least some of them, and it is a testament to American military ingenuity. Back in the 1990s, during the Gulf War, the United States military urgently needed a way to crack Saddam Hussein's ultra-deep, heavily reinforced underground command bunkers. They needed a bomb so heavy and so dense that it could punch through dozens of feet of reinforced concrete before detonating. The engineers looked around, found spent M110 8-inch howitzer barrels, cut them down, filled them with hundreds of pounds of high explosives, attached laser guidance kits, and created the legendary GBU-28 bunker buster bomb. They took the barrel of this artillery piece and literally turned it into a missile. But that piece of history does not tell us what happened to the rest of the fleet. Are there hundreds of ML-110 chassis sitting in the dry heat of the Nevada or Arizona deserts, completely intact but missing their barrels? Or did the United States scrap the vehicles entirely? If it is the former and the hulls are still waiting in the sun, perhaps Ukraine could acquire what is left of America's stockpile and use their own domestic defense industry to forge brand new, modernized barrels for them. The massive Czech artillery initiative, which successfully managed the Greek transfer, could easily facilitate this kind of heavy industrial revival. While it is a speculative idea, it relies on the hope that America still has these mechanical beasts sleeping in the desert, waiting for one last war. But let us move away from the speculative theories and look at the terrifying reality happening right now on the ground. The sudden arrival of the ML-1 howitzer in Ukraine is not just a neat historical footnote. It is actively triggering key shifts in the specific portions of the front lines where this weapon has been unleashed. This is what elevates the ML-1 howitzer from being a dusty Cold War relic into an absolute game changer. To fully grasp this, you have to understand exactly what the ML-1 howitzer brings to a modern Ukrainian artillery crew. For the vast majority of this grueling conflict, Ukraine has been outgunned in terms of pure raw heavy artillery mass. They have had precision, they have had intelligence, but they have lacked the sheer blunt force trauma required to level Russian fortifications in a single shot. The ML-1 howitzer changes the math. It brings several distinct flavors of total devastation to the Russian lines. Let us talk about the physics of this weapon. Every single standard high-explosive shell fired out of the barrel of the ML-1 howitzer weighs roughly 198 pounds. That is nearly 200 pounds of forged steel and high-yield explosives screaming through the air at supersonic speeds. When it impacts a target, the kinetic energy alone is catastrophic. The overpressure from the blast can collapse the lungs of infantry taking cover dozens of yards away. It physically pulverizes concrete bunkers, flips armored personnel carriers like toys, and turns dense forests into splintered wastelands in a matter of seconds. And they do not just have to drop this horror on troops positioned close to the front. Thanks to the M650 rocket-assisted munitions they receive from Greece, the Ukrainian crews can sit safely miles behind the zero line, calculate the coordinates, pull the lanyard, and send this 200-pound nightmare traveling over 18 miles through the sky to perfectly strike whatever Russian asset the drone operators have painted. A Russian general thinks his command post is safe out of range of standard mortar fire. He thinks his ammunition dump is secure. Then the sky tears open, and an 8-inch American shell vaporizes his entire grid square. But raw power means nothing if you cannot survive the counterattack. This is where the M110's design shines. Despite its massive size, it is not a sitting duck. This massive gun is mounted onto a rugged, fully tracked chassis powered by a roaring 405 horsepower diesel engine. It was built to traverse the torn-up, muddy, apocalyptic landscapes of a potential Third World War in Europe. This means the Ukrainian artillery crews can implement shoot-and-scoot tactics. They can roll out of a tree line, drop their massive hydraulic spades into the earth to brace for the recoil, fire 2 catastrophic rounds into a Russian staging area, raise the spades, and drive away before Russian counter-battery radars can even calculate where the shots came from. This mobility allows a single gun to cover a massively wide portion of the battlefield, projecting fear and dominance across entire sectors. However, wielding the hammer of the gods requires a heavy sacrifice, and Ukraine knows this. The logistics of operating this beast are intense. Army recognition details that each M1110 technically requires a crew of 13 highly trained personnel to operate at maximum efficiency. 5 of those soldiers physically ride on the M1110 vehicle itself, acting as the driver, commander, and primary gunners. The rest of the crew has to follow closely behind in a dedicated armored cargo carrier, because the sheer size of the 203mm ammunition means the gun itself can only carry 2 rounds on board. Loading this weapon is an act of intense physical labor combined with heavy machinery. The crew utilizes a hydraulic rammer and crane system to hoist the heavy shells from the cargo carrier, index them into the massive breech, and lock it tight. This massive troop commitment is exactly why Ukraine is not just handing these out to random infantry units. They are being given to elite dedicated artillery brigades who know how to manage complex logistical trains. The crews operating these machines have control over a massive hydraulically powered cannon that can elevate up to 65 degrees, allowing them to drop shells vertically into deep trenches, or lower the barrel to fire directly into the face of an oncoming armored column. The gun can also traverse 30 degrees to the left and right without having to physically move the tracks, allowing for rapid target adjustment. And because this weapon was built during an era where engineers expected electronics to fail under the radiation of a nuclear battlefield, the M11 is equipped with incredibly robust manual backup controls. If a Russian drone manages to damage the hydraulic lines, the Ukrainian crew does not have to abandon the weapon. They can manually crank the gun into position and keep firing. It takes immense physical strength, but it keeps the gun in the fight. Now, critics of the M110 will point out its rate of fire, and they are not entirely wrong. Speed is the one area where this Titan struggles, because the ammunition is so insanely heavy, and the breech mechanism is so massive. The M110 typically fires only 1 round every 2 minutes under sustained combat conditions. If the crew is highly experienced and the situation is absolutely desperate, they can redline the machine and push out 2 rounds a minute, assuming the guys in the cargo carrier can sling the 200-pound shells fast enough. But in the grand scheme of things, the slow rate of fire simply does not matter. The M110 is not designed to be a machine gun. It is not meant to provide a constant suppressive drizzle of light explosives. As military analysts perfectly describe it, the M110 is the ultimate haymaker. Ukraine uses its smaller, faster-firing 105mm and 155mm howitzers to throw rapid jabs at the Russian lines. They keep the Russians pinned down, disoriented, and bleeding. And then, while the Russians are hiding in their bunkers from the rapid fire, the M110 steps in and delivers the knockout punch, firing a shell so massive that the bunker simply ceases to exist. This terrifying combination of layered firepower is precisely why the M110 is altering the battlefield. But beyond the tactical brilliance, there is the cold, hard reality of economics. War is unimaginably expensive, and Ukraine has been bleeding money for years. To understand why this weapon is so important, you have to look at the price tag. Yes, the M110 is vintage equipment. It does not have the sleek lines of a modern HIMARS system, but there is a very good reason why Ukraine happily wired millions of dollars to Greece for 60 of them. Let us do the math. The entire deal cost roughly $230 million. For that price, Ukraine got 60 heavy howitzers and 150,000 rounds of heavy ammunition. If you break that down, factoring in the cost of the vehicles themselves, which were priced at around $600,000 each, the actual cost of a single 203mm shell comes out to a little under $1,300. In the modern theater of war, $1,300 to completely obliterate a multi-million-dollar Russian T-90 tank, or to wipe out a Russian infantry platoon staging for an attack, is the greatest return on investment a military commander could ever dream of. A single guided Excalibur shell for a modern system can cost upwards of $100,000. A single Patriot interceptor missile costs millions. But for the price of a used laptop, Ukraine can load a vintage American shell into a vintage American gun and achieve catastrophic results. All Ukraine has to do is successfully strike a few high-value targets, a radar dish, a command post, a logistics hub, and this entire Greek artillery deal has practically paid for itself tenfold. For a nation facing severe financial strain from fighting the second largest army in the world, this is a financial masterclass. Ukraine is keeping its own operational costs incredibly low while simultaneously inflicting maximum financial and material damage on the Russian Federation. This financial breathing room is vital. While the European Union has committed to massive loans and billions in aid are flowing from the United States, Ukraine's wartime budget is stretched to the absolute breaking point. Every dollar saved on artillery shells is a dollar that can be spent on domestic drone production or feeding frontline troops. The cheap, devastatingly effective MO-110 fits perfectly into this strategy of economic endurance. But let us zoom back into the dirt and the blood of the front lines, because the versatility of the MO-110 is creating nightmare scenarios for Russian commanders. The 52nd Artillery Brigade is currently utilizing a doctrine that is tearing Russian assault waves to pieces. It is all about a layered, deeply integrated approach to indirect fire. Imagine a Russian mechanized battalion is given the order to advance. First, the Ukrainian drone operators spot the buildup. The command center delegates targets. The domestically produced Ukrainian Boldana howitzers, which are incredibly precise and boast an incredible range, are tasked with firing deep behind the Russian lines. Their job is to destroy the Russian fuel trucks, the supply depots, and the electronic warfare stations miles away from the actual fight. They blind and starve the Russian assault before it even begins. Then, as the Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles begin rolling across the fields, Ukraine unleashes the RM-70 Vampire multiple launch rocket systems. The Vampire floods the grid square with dozens of unguided rockets in seconds. This creates chaos. Lightly armored vehicles are shredded. Infantry are forced to dive into trenches or abandon their burning transports. The Russian assault loses its momentum and grinds to a halt in the mud. The surviving Russian troops retreat into hardened concrete pillboxes or heavily reinforced tree-lined bunkers to wait for orders. And that is exactly when the M110 is called into the fight. The Vampires dealt with the soft targets, the Bodanas cut the supply lines, and now the M110 is tasked with cracking open the heavily armored nuts that survived the initial barrage. The American-made Titan rolls into position, elevates its massive barrel, and begins dropping 200-pound high-explosive shells directly onto the bunkers. There is no escape. The reinforced concrete shatters like glass. The shockwaves turn the trench systems into graves. By utilizing this three-tiered system, Ukraine ensures that no part of a Russian assault force is safe, no matter where they hide or what kind of armor they are sitting inside. Right now, military intelligence reports indicate that the 52nd Artillery Brigade is operating heavily in the eastern sectors, specifically around the critical regions of Kharkiv and Kramatorsk. The deployment to Kramatorsk is incredibly significant. Kramatorsk is not just a town, it is a fortress. It is one of the 4 heavily fortified interconnected cities that make up the legendary Donetsk Fortress Belt. This belt is a sprawling, heavily entrenched defensive line stretching over 30 miles along the vital highway systems. Kramatorsk acts as the northern anchor of this massive defensive shield. It is the city that must hold at all costs. If Kramatorsk falls, the entire region is in jeopardy, and Vladimir Putin moves one step closer to his ultimate goal of fully capturing the Donbass. But Ukraine has spent an entire decade preparing for this exact scenario. Ever since the initial Russian incursions in 2014, Ukrainian combat engineers have been pouring concrete, digging tunnels, and laying traps around Kramatorsk. It was already a literal hellscape for any invading Russian force, but now with the M1110s prowling behind the defensive lines, Kramatorsk has become a death trap. Any gathering of Russian troops attempting to stage an assault on the city, any armored column trying to navigate the mined roads is going to be met with an apocalyptic volume of heavy artillery fire that their commanders are simply not prepared to handle. The psychological terror of knowing that at any moment a 200-pound shell could fall from the sky with almost no warning is enough to break the morale of even the most hardened Russian conscript. But the 52nd Brigade cannot be everywhere at once. Ukraine bought 60 of these beasts, and there are plenty more waiting in the wings, ready to be deployed to other critical sectors. This opens up terrifying new strategies for the Ukrainian generals, specifically when it comes to the integration of the M1110 into what they call kill zones. If you want to understand why the Russian military has lost hundreds of thousands of men for mere yards of territory, you have to understand the anatomy of a Ukrainian kill zone. These are not just random minefields. They are highly engineered, miles-long stretches of terrain designed with a single brutal purpose: to completely eradicate human life and heavy machinery. A typical kill zone is a masterpiece of lethal geometry. First, you have the anti-tank ditches, massive deep trenches carved into the earth that physically prevent tanks from moving forward. Then you have the Dragon's Teeth, rows of jagged concrete pyramids designed to rip the tracks off of any vehicle that tries to push through. Behind that, you have miles of razor wire and anti-personnel mines to stop the infantry. And above it all, a constant buzzing swarm of FPV kamikaze drones watching everything, waiting to drop explosives into open tank hatches. Now, when a Russian commander looks at a kill zone, he knows he cannot just drive his tanks straight through it. It is suicide, so he orders his forces to go around it. But that is exactly what the Ukrainians want. The kill zone is actually a trap designed to funnel the Russian forces. By blocking the direct path, the Ukrainians force the Russian tanks and infantry to bypass the obstacles, pushing them directly into wide-open, pre-sighted spaces. These spaces look safe to the Russians. There are no mines, no dragon's teeth, but they are actually meticulously mapped ambush points. Once the Russian forces are funneled tightly into these open pockets, the trap snaps shut. The Ukrainian spotter drones lock onto the grid coordinates, and they call in the artillery. Now imagine being a Russian soldier caught in that funnel. You cannot go forward because of the minefields. You cannot go back because your commanders will shoot you. The kamikaze drones are diving out of the sky, tearing through your armored transports, and then the radio crackles. The MO-110s have fired. You hear the deep, ripping sound of the air tearing apart as 200-pound artillery shells plummet from the sky directly into the tightly packed ambush point. Nothing survives that. No amount of Russian body armor, no reactive armor plates on a tank can withstand a direct or near-direct hit from an 8-inch howitzer shell. The sheer concussive force alone will disable a vehicle and kill the crew inside. This is the grim reality that awaits the Russian army as they continue their desperate offensives. The already lethal, highly sophisticated kill zones engineered by Ukraine have just been upgraded with the raw, brutal, city-leveling power of an old American Cold War titan. It is a fascinating irony of modern warfare. The Russian military, desperate and running low on highly trained elite units, has resorted to primitive tactics. They are relying on sheer numbers, sending wave after wave of poorly trained conscripts and aging armor to blindly batter against Ukrainian defenses in the hopes that the Ukrainians will eventually run out of bullets. It is a tactic straight out of the First World War. But by using ancient, brutal strategies, the Russians have made themselves the absolute perfect prey for an older, brutal weapon. The M100 was literally designed to obliterate massive Soviet armored columns rushing across the plains of Europe. It was built for a war of mass and attrition. The Russian offensive is slow-moving, predictable, and dense. It is a target-rich environment, and the M100 is the ultimate predator. A weapon of mass destruction from a bygone era has been fully revitalized, dusted off, and unleashed in the mud of Eastern Europe. If Vladimir Putin insists on fighting a war using the ancient bloody strategies of the past, Ukraine has proven that they are more than willing to use the most destructive weapons of the past to counteract him. And knowing the ingenuity of the Ukrainian military, the odds are incredibly high that we have not even seen the full potential of these weapons yet. The Ukrainian armed forces specialize in taking Western equipment, tearing it apart, and upgrading it in ways the original engineers never even thought possible. We have seen them do it with commercial drones, we have seen them do it with the Patriot missile system, and we have seen them do it with their M1 Abrams tanks, strapping explosive reactive armor onto every available surface to turn them into unstoppable juggernauts. It is almost a guarantee that within a few months we will see footage of Ukrainian M110s modified with advanced anti-drone cages, integrated with Starlink satellite terminals for instantaneous targeting data, and firing highly modified, locally produced drone-assisted munitions. The United States built the gun, Greece provided the ammunition, but Ukraine is going to perfect the art of killing with it. The Cold War is finally getting hot, and American steel is doing exactly what it was forged to do. The battlefield is shifting, the ground is shaking, and the roar of the massive 203mm howitzer is echoing across the Donbass. If you want to understand exactly how Ukraine is outsmarting the Russian war machine, how they are upgrading Western tanks to be entirely indestructible, and how this brutal conflict is reshaping the future of global warfare, you need to stay informed. The tactics are changing every single day, and the weapons being deployed are becoming more devastating by the hour. Stay engaged, stay alert, and never underestimate the sheer destructive power of a nation fighting for its right to exist. Keep your eyes on the front lines, because the Mi-110 has arrived, and the shockwaves are just beginning.